For this first leaf practice, there's a lot of different techniques that we did on the previous two handouts that we're gonna try to apply into the leaf and then the flower. For the leaf, we're gonna start out with making sure we're following hue, tint, and shade, which basically means having areas that are light, medium toned, and dark shadows. We're gonna use the feather out technique, which is where you start with the solid line or the darker color and try to feather that out into your lighter section. Create texture, so either using salt or saran wrap, and then lift and resist. So a lot of different techniques to think about and try to figure out how to apply into this leaf practice. And then you do need to use at least 2 layers of paint, which will naturally come as we're filling this in. So to start out with, I would definitely recommend following hue, tint, and shade, feathering out the area, and then lifting and resist as we're working on our second layer. So to get started, I'm gonna use my paintbrush and just do a light layer for this kind of light green area. So I'm gonna try to color match, use a good amount of water. I'm using more of a medium-sized brush now. And just filling in the leaf here. So getting this all filled in with my first layer. You also could have put water down first if you had wanted to try to make this blend or get filled in a little bit quicker. So now I have my first layer, and what I can start to do is the feather out technique next, and this will hit a couple of bases because it will also create more of the hue and the shade. So I'm gonna start with my green here, where it's a little bit darker. So this bottom part of the leaf is darker in my reference picture. Then I'm also gonna use a darker green. If you don't have a darker green on your paint palette, just try to mix a little bit of black with it. And I'm even gonna mix some black into this darker green. But you'll notice that I am only working with a small area, so I'm not filling in that whole bottom half of the leaf, even though it's darker. This is where the feather out technique is gonna come into play. So I'm gonna grab some more water on my brush and just start to feather out what I have here into the rest of the leaf. So I'm slowly adding some water into it. And then grabbing more water as I go. And this is gonna start to soften the value so that it's not as dark and it fades it out a little bit more. So this is starting to blend it here, bringing it out to the side, adding more water, and slowly feathering this out until you cannot see where the edge of my color starts or stops. So that's a nice kind of feather from the dark into the light. At this point, I would let it dry so that you know if you do need to go over it with another layer or if this is dark enough. Instead of letting it completely dry, another option too would be to bring in either your salt or saran wrap at this point to work with a little bit of texture. So I'm gonna go ahead and use just a little bit of my saran wrap now. So I'm not necessarily going to texture the entire leaf. And I'm gonna add that to this area here at the bottom and press that down. And then I will give that a few minutes to dry and then come back to it so I have just that little bit of texture at the bottom of my leaf. So while this is drying, I'm gonna come up to the right half of my leaf here and look at creating more value change in this section. So right now I have a lighter value, but when I look at my reference picture, the lighter value is only in a few spots. So in this area, I'm going to use my lift and the resist technique. So I'm gonna start out with just filling in with a crayon on top of this, a few areas where I want it to stay as a solid color. So as I'm filling this in, my paper is still a little bit wet. So I'm gonna try to make sure it doesn't completely rip. If we're working with watercolor paper, you're not going to run into this issue as much. But what I'm doing now is just kind of adding a texture with this. So when you look at the leaf, it does have a little bit of a texture on top. So I'm kind of going over some of those darker lines on the picture and just adding a little bit of texture into it with the crayon. So this could be either with a gray or a white crayon, green, or a different color, really doesn't matter. So again, I did rip a few areas, not a huge deal. Final projects, you'll be using watercolor paper, so it's not going to rip as easily as that. So now I'm gonna work with my darker color again. I'm gonna grab some water and then use my dark green and paint on top of this with my dark green. And then I do wanna bring some black into it so it's not a super bright color. And then bring maybe a little bit of yellow to lighten that since I did add a lot of black to it. So I'm gonna pull this down just a little bit. And as I do, you'll see the resist with the crayon where it's not completely showing up on some of those areas of texture. And I'm trying to make sure that I have plenty of water, bringing this down. And then I'm looking at these areas that are lighter that I want to pull that color off of. So I'm gonna take my paper towel and just soak up some of those areas of green where I want it to be a little bit lighter. So again, this is the pull technique. All right, so now I'm gonna stop there and take off my saran wrap so you can see that little bit of texture at the bottom, and then zoom out so we can start to look at what else needs to be added into this leaf or what else needs to be refined. So just looking, this area on the right does need another darker layer. So I could either do the feather technique, the pull technique, or whatever you felt was working best. So I'm gonna fill in just a little bit darker around the edges here. And just like before, bring in a little bit of black. And then for this, I'm gonna do that feather technique again. So I'm just gonna pull some of this out with the water and just gradually fade that into my leaf. All right, so last thing would be a detail layer. I'm gonna go ahead and let this dry for a little bit before we come back for the last layer of paint. So coming back to this leaf now, I wanna do just a little bit of texture and detail as a top layer. So I'm using a really thin paintbrush to bring in a little bit of detail. I'm gonna start with my darker green, and I'll probably wanna bring in and mix some black with it, but I'm just looking at areas along kind of these lines here and in between that are slightly darker that I can add some texture to. So I do wanna mix this green with my black so that it's not as bright of a green, and just try to bring in some of this detail. So it's darker on the top here, so I'm gonna fade that down and just kind of look at those individual areas. So bringing in some of this darker green, a little bit on the stem here, and watering this down a bit to blend it out. And then I'm just gonna continue working on looking at those specific areas that I can bring more detail into. So all the way along the edge of the leaf here, leaving more of those highlights in between. And I'm almost using a dry brush technique with this in order to create some more texture in it. So it's darker on the top, bringing that darker value down on both sides. And bringing in some darker values in here and a little bit on this side. So I'm trying to leave those areas that are highlights as light as I can. So focus on highlights, shadows, and details as your top layer.